Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you, Eva. That was beautiful. I'm a minister, so I do things scared all of the time, and that music made me feel like I was supposed to be a little bit more scared than I already was. So thank you for setting the tone. I'm Reverend Michelle Scott Huffman. My pronouns are she and her. I am a middle-aged white woman with short, spiky, mostly silver, some brownish hair, wearing my normal gray and black. So glad to be here today. Before I share today's message, I do want to offer a brief content note to say that much of the message revolves around death and our relationship to it. I recognize that some folks may not be in a mental, spiritual, or emotional space where they can engage with that topic. So I want to encourage you to do whatever it is that you need to do at any time during this message, to take time for yourself and your needs, to encourage you who are parents to think about what you might say if questions should arise. So each month, a group of people gather together to talk about the Soul Matters theme. It's a theme that we use to figure out our worship services and our discussion groups and religious education and all of the different conversations that we're having in the church. A space where we talk about a theme. This month's theme is courage. And the ways that we might engage that theme in sort of a multidisciplinary, multi-sensory kind of way. And so as we were talking about the theme of courage this month, we talked about the sort of subcategories that came with it. They were personal courage and social courage and wholehearted courage. And we got to the last Sunday of the month and it said Halloween and courage, of course. And so today, as we think about this sort of intersection of Halloween is tomorrow, and this afternoon we're going to have young people in our parking lot doing trunk or treat. Hopefully all of your cars will be there. That's my plug for you to come back around 3 o'clock, 3:30 to get set up for trunk or treat. We'll be doing that. And later in this service today, we will be observing All Souls, a really beautiful, somber time where we remember the people who have been members and friends of this congregation who are no longer with us, who have died in the past year. And as we talked about the ways to create a space that honored kids, possibly in costumes, dressed up for the Halloween celebrations, a space that was celebratory and a space that was properly somber for an All Souls observance. 5 or 6 weeks ago when we had that conversation, it felt really disjointed, like it would be hard to fit it all in, hard to get it all into one place. But somehow today, it just feels like life. The ways that sorrow and joy are all tied up together, the ways that our celebrations are connected to times of deep memory and times of honoring those who have come before us. And so as we think about Halloween and courage and All Souls Day, we're thinking about how it is that we do things scared, as AJ talked about in the moment of perspective. Now, since we had that conversation several weeks ago, I've officiated 3 beautiful celebrations of life and said a final farewell to one very dear friend. So perhaps all of that is coloring the lens through which I see this Halloween/All Souls Day season, but it does feel like it's all about mortality and our relationship with it, and all about the way that living and dying are all tied up together, and the way that we live well is connected in some ways to the way that we relate to the eventual time when we won't be here anymore. Whether we look at Halloween and see the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain, Lord of the Dead, or we connect to the more recent Western Christian tradition of All Hallows Eve, the night before All Saints Day, which comes before All Souls Day, making up the mini season of All Hallow Tide. I appreciate seasons that end in the word tide for some reason. All of that thanks to Pope Gregory IV and his moving the observance of All Saints Day from March 13th to November 1st in 835 of the Common Era. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that the Christian traditions around All Hallow Tide are disconnected from Samhain, because we probably know that there was a blending of cultures and beliefs at best, and more likely probably straight up appropriation and co-opting of traditions. But some folks come to the celebration of those holidays and those feasts from different starting points. So Britannica explains some of the traditions of Halloween derived from the earlier Samhain in this way. During the Samhain festival, the souls of those who have died were believed to return to visit their homes. And those who had died during the year were believed to journey to the other world. People set bonfires on hilltops for relighting their hearth fires for the winter and to frighten away evil spirits. And they sometimes wore masks and other disguises to avoid being recognized by the ghosts thought to be present. It was in those ways that beings such as witches, hobgoblins, fairies, and demons came to be associated with the day. The period was also thought to be a favorable time for divination on matters such as marriage, health, and death. And so it is that our interaction with and reflection on death is full of life, like the celebration of Halloween. And vice versa, our choices about life and the way we live it can in many ways be impacted by our beliefs about, attitudes toward, and fear of death. Now, something strange has been going on in my life this year. Westminster College, where I often say I serve the religious studies department as the adjunct of last resort, asked me in the spring semester to teach 2 classes this fall: social justice and modern Christian movements and perspectives on death. I said yes, because I love to teach, and I was most excited about the social justice class. I began building the syllabus right away. The other one I slacked off a bit on. As it would turn out, the social justice class didn't make, but the death class did. So as I went through this year from spring up to the time that I started teaching the class, I was paying close attention to resources and ideas around death. And my imagination would move in strange ways around these topics. And I came home from a metaphysical bookstore one day with the Pagan Book of Living and Dying, which was especially fun to read on the plane during my summer travels. You know, when you're sitting next to a person on the plane and you feel awkward and you're almost on top of them and you want to disconnect, so you say, "What are you reading?" Yeah, so those conversations got shut down pretty quickly. And when I wasn't reading that book and decided instead to relax and just listen to a book for fun, which I often don't have time to do. So I have one author that I read or listen to. It's Jodi Picoult. That's my sort of my guilty pleasure in life. So I listened to 2 of her books this summer, and both of them had strong themes around death, near-death experience, death doulas, ancient burial customs. It's like it was everywhere, all around me. On top of that, we were having these conversations in the Pastoral Care Committee about an exciting new program in the UU with a comprehensive curriculum related to our relationship with death called Date with Death Club, which you'll hear more about later. In other words, in my own life, death, attitudes toward it, preparation for it, words spoken after it, feelings around it, have all been front and center for the better part of this year. And I think it's made me more fully alive. Making peace with our mortality is perhaps one of the biggest and most important projects of our human existence. When we don't do that, we spend much of our life operating out of a place of fear. It is to many the scariest of the scary stuff. In some ways, we have to step outside of what have become our cultural norms and practices of denying mortality and doing everything technologically and medically possible to extend life in order to begin making that peace. As I think of the series of TikTok videos that AJ shared, I think that facing mortality is one of the things that we just do scared for a while, until we find a peace that assuages the fear. And the folks who have done a lot of thinking and writing and talking about this suggest that we can even take it further than that. Mortality coach Andrew Petty of the podcast Andrew Petty is Dying asks, what if our mortality is the most powerful source of motivation in life? And failing to confront it, we're doing ourselves much more harm than good. In the first chapter of the pagan book of Living and Dying, Starhawk begins by writing beautifully about the cycles of life and death in nature, and the efficiency with which dead things get consumed and used by living things to grow and thrive. She writes, from the time of the emergence of the human beings as thinking, conscious species, people who have lived embedded in nature have observed these processes in action and have acknowledged our dependence upon them by naming them sacred. She also says that for human beings, the death of a leaf at the end of summer, the culling of seedlings, or the salmon's end after spawning is easy to accept as part of the natural cycle. But our own death, or the death of those we love, is just not. We feel fear, grief, and pain at the thought of our own consciousness coming to an end. This sentiment tracks with much of what's been covered with my students in our interdisciplinary textbook, The Last Dance, with what's discussed in the Date with Death material in practical and spiritual terms, and even in the podcast series with Andrew Petty, who is part life coach and part motivational speaker. Petty regularly asks listeners, what role does death play in your life? And follows up with, death does play a role in our life. It's just a matter of how aware we are of the role that it's playing. For many of us, we are consciously and unconsciously holding the awareness of our mortality at arm's length. One of Petty's podcast guests was Dr. Frederick Tate, who specialized in end-of-life care, who did a lot of work with AIDS hospice in the 1980s. He trained under Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is known as the mother of thanatology, or the scientific discipline that examines death from many perspectives. Tate notes that he learned a lot from Dr. Kubler-Ross, but he's learned so much more about living and what is important from people who were dying, and in particular, from the regrets that people shared on their deathbed, which he said were primarily focused around personal relationships and, surprisingly to him, travel. He states simply, life is very fragile and very short, so get off your butt and go see those places. And he talks about the negative impacts of our repression of feelings and experiences, as well as a lack of adequate symbols in art and culture related to death, saying a large part of the violence in our country and lack of civility in Western society today is because of our denial of death. There's a lot to unpack there and not much room for it here today, but it's important to note that Dr. Tate sees a spiritual void that is individual and communal, and a moral and ethical void that is directly connected to our avoidance of mortality. He says, in fact, Halloween and the Day of the Dead are the two most important holidays that we can celebrate because it does bring up some discussion and some honoring of death as a part of life. And so today, as we prepare to celebrate Halloween with a trunk or treat, with all the ways that we'll invite children in our neighborhoods to come by and get treats tomorrow dressed up in those masks that may have originally been intended to fend off the evil spirits of those who had left. And as we remember members and friends who have died in the last year, my hope is that we all might take our own spiritual journey into the exploration of our relationship with mortality, not in order to be consumed by it or to be in fear of it, but to be enlightened by it and maybe challenged by it in such a way that we might live fully in the present with an eye toward what we want to make sure we get done, who we want to be sure to love well, and the legacy that we'd like to leave behind someday. Last weekend, I did a memorial service for a dear friend with whom I got to talk a couple of times in the months and weeks before his death. And his biggest fear was not existing anymore, just not being here. And one of the conversations led to someone saying, as long as your name is still on somebody's lips, you're still here. And we talked about the legacy that he would leave and the way that he wanted to impact people and the importance of what he did in the world and the way that he made a change that would long live after he was no longer here. And so if anything, if this convergence of holidays invites us to think about our own mortality, about the loss of those who have been important to us, but who will no longer be here present with us, may it bring us to the place in our own spiritual journey where we think deeply about the way that we want to impact the world that we've been blessed to live in and the world that has been blessed by our presence. So friends, today I invite you into that place, not a place of morbid thought about mortality, but a place of spiritual growth that invites us both to accept and to, in some ways, be ready. And in the Date with Death Club, we'll talk about in very practical ways being ready, in ways that will be helpful to your family members or friends when you're not here anymore. To think about the spiritual realm, what we leave behind, what we take with us, and who has been a part of our journey. What a beautiful opportunity to connect in those ways while we still can. In Andrew Petty's podcast, he says, I'm Andrew Petty and I'm dying, and so are you. But we're not dead yet, so let's get to it. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.